So welcome to you and welcome to the people who are following online theology, Sunday theology class. So we are still in the series of lectures devoted to Jesus. There's another one coming, and if you also remember, the first one of lectures was about, or more focused on, what it means for Jesus to be God, whereas since last week in particular, we are reflecting on what it means for Jesus to be human. To what extent is he really a human? What does it mean for Jesus to be human? Last time we saw more the theological reflection on this subject, and I am aware that talking about natures, hypostases, whether he had two wills or two souls, etc., one person, two natures, it's a bit technical, but it is the way in which the theological reflection has tried over 5 centuries to make sense of the identity of Jesus. Today is going to be a bit more, I hope, close to home, because I really would like to kind of zoom in on Jesus the man, Jesus the human person like you and me, and see the extent to which it is possible to have an idea of who he really was. So I started. I mean, it's a bit of a it's almost playful by pointing out to something about Jesus' physical aspect. I mean, if he was, and as we believe he was, and we have evidence of it, a human person like you and me, he must have looked like something. And you know, the first image which I put there is this terrible kind of stereotypical version of the way Jesus is usually represented, the familiar image of Jesus. And it's quite interesting to know at the very origin, what is at the very origin of this stereotypical version of Jesus, the white, tall, blonde man with long hair, long beard, and blue eyes, which is, you know, doesn't make any sense from the viewpoint of the ethnical background of Jesus. Well, it comes from the Byzantine ways of representing Jesus. And especially on the image of you have here number 2 in your handout, the Byzantine images of an enthroned emperor. So one of the oldest representations of Jesus in this way can be found in the mosaic of a church in Rome, Santa Prudenziana, in which I'm sorry, I didn't print these in colors, just a bit too complicated with a small color print here. But you can see that Jesus is sitting. So it's the big image in page on the following page under number 2, in which you can see the wider image. Jesus is sitting on a throne. Okay, and he's dressed in a gold toga. You can tell from the image, I'm afraid. And he is the heavenly ruler of all the world, which is basically borrowed from an image of Zeus, the Olympian Zeus on a throne, which I put you on the other side. So basically, the image of Jesus we are accustomed to is the origin of this image comes from the way in which Greek deities, in particular Zeus, was represented. Okay? Now, in the Gospels, Jesus is not described either as tall or short, good-looking, or plain, muscular, or frail. We don't know anything about how he looked like. We are told only that his age was 30. He was 30 years of age, but there is nothing that dramatically distinguishes him, at least at first sight. Experts who have studied, archaeologists who have studied ancient skeletons in Israel, find that Judeans of Jesus' time were closest biologically to Iraqi Jews of the contemporary world. So he had dark brown or black hair, he had deep brown eyes and olive brown skin. He looked like a Palestinian man or an Iraqi Jew man of today. He would have been told probably 5.5 feet tall. And then the image you have below, so the anthropologist Richard Need in 2001 created a model of a Galilean man for his BBC documentary, Son of God, working on the basis of an actual skull found in the region. He did not claim, of course, that this was Jesus' face. It was simply meant to prompt people to consider Jesus as being a man of his time and his place. Probably Jesus certainly didn't look like exactly like this, but this is the range. This is how he might have looked like. He's a bit Socratic here in the representation. The closest correspondence, I'm quoting here a study, so I put you in the footnotes a number of studies you can look at. And this is a study by John E. Taylor, what Jesus did look like, which is a bit, the major reference in this field. The closest correspondence to what Jesus really looked like is found according to her, in the depiction of Moses on the walls of the 3rd century synagogue of Dura Europos. It shows a Jewish man, you have this in number 6, after number 6-2, a Jewish stage imagined in the Greco-Roman world. So in this picture, it is Moses, but it is meant to represent, it is the closest thing we have, according to Taylor, to what Jesus must have looked like, short-haired and with a slight beard. I think it's interesting to know these things and to think about this. Now, Jesus is a human being in the Gospels. I don't need to insist too much on this. This is all very familiar to us. If there is actually a trait of Jesus' identity in the Gospels are emphatic about, is the reality of his humanity. In the Gospels are very clear about it. So they don't give us many details. The Gospels are not a biography. They do not say much about Jesus' identity, but they do say that he had a human birth. The passages you know very well from Luke and Matthew, and I'm going to read them extensively. Then you go to number 9. He had a human ancestry. In Luke's gospel, his family line is traced all the way back to Adam. And in Matthew's gospel, he descends from Abraham through King David. Even though these genealogies in 9:1 are fictional, they presuppose that for the authors of the gospel, Jesus did come from a lineage of real historical characters, especially from King David. Then, the gospel tell us, number 10, that Jesus grew up. So he didn't come out of the box completed. He was born as a child. And towards the end, I would just want to tell you a couple of elements that I think would help us to realize the extent to which Jesus was human. So he grew both in stature and wisdom. He had a family, he had a mother, Mary, and a father, Joseph, whether or not he was his biological father. And there's a huge amount of literature on this. He was the father he grew up with. So for all intents and purposes, it was his real father. So then, number 12, he was a Jewish man. So the Jewish identity of Jesus has been underestimated and valued, but it is absolutely essential to understand him, and it has been discovered in recent studies. Then he had a body. Of course, he did. References to him touching, reaching out, and the physical companionship he established with the physical proximity he had to his disciples and the people he got in touch with is absolutely everywhere in the Gospels. It is very important for the Gospels that God in Jesus had a body. Then he experienced hunger and thirst, tiredness, sleep, human emotions. The human emotions of Jesus are particularly important. Number 17. So scripture records that he wept over his friend Lazarus, wept over the city of Jerusalem. He marveled. He was sorrowful unto death, troubled. And then, there are instances of his anger, his disappointment, etc., etc. So the whole range of emotions is recorded there. Human knowledge, of course, they didn't have human knowledge entirely. One can think he was God, so he knew everything from the beginning. And already last time I told you that there are clear instances in the Gospels in which it is shown that Jesus did not know everything. So the very first passage, number 18, which I've already quoted to you, that Jesus increased in knowledge and stature, shows that he didn't have the whole knowledge. And then he acknowledges that he does not know some things, so particularly the last day and hour. Okay. Then he did have a human will, since there is this contrast between his will and the will of the Father. Number 19, 1:9, Jesus prays to the Father, not as I will, but as you will. So there must have been a human will there. And then, love, compassion, disappointment, anger, angst, I mentioned to you, physical pain, and he was human being to the point of death. So I know that you know all these things, but I think it was really important to, give you quotations and focus attention to this aspect of the testimony of the Gospels. You'll remember a passage which I quoted to you several times, the beginning of the first letter of St. John, in which they do say not just what we heard and what we saw, but what we touched, okay, and what we were touched by. This is essential in terms of understanding who Jesus is. And in terms of his humanity, there is an aspect which really strikes me. And for this, I want you to go at the end of the handout. I thought I would tell you this at the end, but I think it's better we mention this now. Number 49. I quoted a couple of passages from a book, Touched by God, which I wrote a few years ago on contemplation, in which I tried to reflect on what it means for God not just wanting to talk to us, not just wanting to be understood by us, but wanting to reach us by becoming flesh. Jesus is not afraid of plunging into a mess, exposing himself to the hazards of human existence, joining our uncertain journey, making himself vulnerable to a need of loving and being loved, allowing himself to be touched by us. Thus he became a child, and that's an aspect which is quite interesting. So a human being cannot express self emotionally, cannot even develop an emotional palette, an emotional kind of range, unless he or she is touched by his mother and his father at very early stage of their lives. So not only the nurturing, the love, the affection of parents, but the actual physical touch is absolutely essential to even becoming able to speak, even becoming able to interact with other people. There is a famous kind of anecdote in the 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and especially after the fall of the Romanian dictator, so Ceausescu, it was discovered that in Romania absolutely forbade abortion and contraception. So there were a huge number of children were born and abandoned immediately after they were born. And they were all kind of sent into orphanages, where absolutely understaffed orphanages, which they had literally hundreds of children, and for each nurse had to look after 30, 40, 50 children. So you saw these horrific images of trolleys with 3 or 4 levels. On each of the levels there were 3 or 4 children, and they were changed serially, fed serially, without any emotional interaction. When the Berlin Wall fell, there was this BBC documentary, and a certain number of these children were adopted by British English families. And then they showed the evolution of these children. And one thing which was striking in this documentary was that none of these children was able to interact emotionally with people. They would put them on, even at the age of 3 or 4, onto a lawn. They would not touch the lawn. They would not sit. They were not react. Then slowly they developed up to a certain extent. But the fact of not having been, not only not having had the nurturing of a mother or a father, but not being touched when they were children, didn't allow them to develop that aspect of humanity. So if Jesus was so able to empathize, so able to touch and be touched, to love, etc., where did he get it from? He got it from the fact that he was raised like every lucky child from a loving mother and a loving father. So that's a thing which, to me, says a lot about his humanity. So this is a sentence which I put here. He became a child who, like all of us, would not have been able to constitute his identity, acquire the ability to feel, speak, walk, develop emotionally, humanly, and intellectually, had he not benefited from the loving and caring touch of a mother and the reassuring and enveloping embrace of a father. Okay, and then you can carry on reading the rest of this passage if you want at home, in which I tried to list all the ways in which Jesus went beyond what is usually expected, especially by a male in that culture, in terms of his compassion, his desire to embrace, and the intimacy he had with his disciples, with both men and women. So this is for your reflection. But I want to go back to number, let's see, number 29 on your handout. Yes, actually number 27. And just give you a sense of how difficult it is to paint a portrayal of Jesus as a human being, to understand really closely what his character was, what his personality was, And yet at the same time, the immense fascination that the gospel have exercised on believers and unbelievers alike, and the fact that, yes, the gospels on one hand have given rise to immensely contrasting pictures, depictions, portrayals of Jesus, which may lead us to think, oh, they are not enough to know who Jesus was. But on the other hand, probably, this is surely intentional, probably this is why they, in a certain sense, allow us to go close to who Jesus was in a different way. So, number 27, clearly the intentions of the Gospels was not to present a psychological portrayal of Jesus. But this has not prevented the flourishing of a huge literature on the subject. So I thought it would be interesting to compare two opposite attempts to reconstruct Jesus' personality. One by the renowned theologian, German theologian Romano Guardini. He has an Italian name, but he was German, in the middle of the 20th century, who was a original thinker in many ways, but also very conservative one when it came to portrayals of Jesus. And on the other hand, on the opposite spectrum, I gave you some quotation from the now retired Presbyterian theologian and ordained minister still alive, J. Harold Ellens from the University of Michigan in the United States. So when it comes to Romano Guardini's portrayal, in Jesus, he says, we observe various kinds of emotional reaction. So certainly the Gospels lift the veil over an incredibly rich emotional life when it comes to Jesus. This shows us that he was not cold and aloof, either by nature or by self-discipline. Thus, we learn that he had pity on the people because of their suffering, very evident trait of Jesus, that he looked and loved a man in whom something special was going on, the young rich man, if you remember, that he was irritated by the hypocrites, that he expressed anger at the stupidity of his disciples. Do you yet not know or understand? You know, this is something that comes often. He expressed anger, yes. He rejoiced in the Holy Spirit. And obviously, the sick and the suffering would never have come to him with such confidence, says Romano Guardini. Children would have never approached him for a blessing had they not felt a warm sympathy emanating from him. So it's a warm, empathetic, kind of loving character. And the other trait Romano Guardini, thinks he can work out from, extrapolate from what the Gospels say about Jesus, number 30, is that, yes, he was someone who had, had a rich emotional life, and yet at the same time, the impression, he says, we have of Jesus' nature is one of complete calm, under all conditions, a calm which has the same origin as his fearlessness. When Jesus began to speak of the terrible things which were to happen to him, and Peter tried to remonstrate with him, we are told that he turned and upbraided. It was as though he could not bear to hear anything that might upset his decision. And one feels how his inner calm, again, was being threatened by the horror of what was to happen. All the more impressive, therefore, is the way in which his calm continues. So is this calm kind of character. But he's sure at the same time, and this comes very often in these portrayals of Jesus, and I'll show you another instance, number 13:3. Let us stress once more, however, that in all this there is no trace of the imperturbability of the Stoic or the renunciation of Buddha. So they say Jesus is not a Buddha in the sense that he's not he's not Zen. It's not like he does react emotionally. Now, this is, I think, the misinterpretation, of course, of Buddhism. Of course, these are kind of always projected images. But yes, the important thing is that in the way they understand Jesus, even when they try to say that, like Romano Guardini does, that what strikes about him is his calm, he was not impassible. He was not. He did not insulate himself from the emotions, and this is quite clear in the Gospels. Okay, charming, right? Now let's go on the other opposite spectrum. So there is another psychological attempt to reconstruct the psychology of Jesus, and this is by J. Harold Ellens. I gave you the quotation on notes, and there is a link, an internet link. For all the things I quoted here, I gave you a link on the web, and you can go and find the text. These are short texts, they're articles, and they are really worth reading. And I think this portrayal of Jesus by Ellens also is worth reading, even if it is very, the image that comes out is not one we are probably comfortable with. So he says, just as there is this kind of mawkish portrait of Jesus, which I showed you at the beginning, which has become a standard, it's the one here. So there is a standard kind of syrupy presentation of Jesus, portrait of Jesus enshrined in our hymns, number 32, and hearts, that is a dominant presence controlling our notions and emotions about the nature and character of Jesus. That is the line from the popular song, Gentle Jesus, Meek and Mild. Okay? Ironically, she says, Jesus was none of those, meek and mild. A notion of Jesus as gentle surely arises from mistreatment of children. Okay? But even that, Ellens thinks doesn't vouch this interpretation. And we are going to see this in a little bit. She starts by saying in number 34 that Jesus was ambivalent about women and occasionally abusive to them, particularly his mother. So he says when his Jewish mother nagged him about having disturbed a trip from Jerusalem to Galilee when he got lost and made her anxious and uncomfortable, he shot back sharply at her, asking why she was worried, even that she should have known that he would be about his heavenly Father. This is why are you looking for me? Don't you know that I have to look after the things of my Father? Then at Cana in Galilee, he castigated his mother when she says, "Oh, they don't have any more wine," and he replies to his mother, "What woman?" Something like, I can't remember, "What is between you and me?" Something of this kind. So he castigated her with apparently denigration. What is that to you and me? This is not the time to mention that kind of stuff. This is the rendering of it. But even more kind of strange is the other episode when she and his siblings, having heard him claim that he was the Messiah, thought him deranged. This is said in the Gospels, and came to Capernaum to take him home to care for him. And he ignored his mother. Indeed, he publicly put her down and shamed her by rhetorically asking the crowd who they thought his mother and brothers were. Then he declared that his true family was made up of his followers, who listened to his preaching and were devoted to his ways. Then there is a whole passage here. I'm not going to read the whole thing about the healing of the blind man in the Gospel of John, which is usually seen as, oh, Jesus having pity of this this blind man who had been blind for so many years. But it is true that if you can have another reading of the passage. So this man, yes, he was blind, he was a beggar, but he was socially a part of the social construct of Jewish society, and he had a place in it. Now, what happens is that because Jesus heals him on a Sabbath, this upsets the Pharisees and the scribes. They interrogate this man. This man says, well, the only thing I know is that I've been healed. I didn't see before, I see now. So I have no explanation as to how this has happened. But everyone knows that unless God has intervened, this can't happen. Sorry. And for this reason, he is thrown out of the temple and excluded from the social life of the social fabric of the Jewish population of that time, he and his family. So Ellen thinks that this is an instance in which it is shown that Jesus could have healed him on a Tuesday, and this would have not led to him being having to pay the price of Jesus making a political point. So if you go to number 35 on your handout, there's a bit of a summary of her argument. Although in the end, she says, he came to know Jesus, the blind man, he was under the Mosaic law a despised vagabond in Judaism. He had become, because he had been excluded as a consequence of having been healed by Jesus and having acknowledged that. His latter stage, she says, were worse than the first in the most important way. Jesus, he says, used him to make a political point and then left him isolated from the loved ones and friends who were now forbidden by the authorities from consorting with him. Jesus could be, she says, fairly ruthless to others, not just to his mother. Then she carried on arguing that Jesus was 36 ruthless to religious leaders, which is certainly harsh. He called them vipers and serpents and all kind of stuff. And this came from the sharp kind of position or between his understanding of the way in which society and Jewish religion could be reformed and the one promoted by the Pharisees, which I think is quite interesting. In number 37, they, the Pharisees and the scribes and Sadducees, were intent upon following the covenant of Moses that requires simply the adherence to the laws of the Torah as the authorities articulated it. The Pharisees wanted to reform Israel from the outside in. They thought that controlling a person's behavior would produce an inner spiritual renewal. Jesus, on the other hand, knew that spiritual conversion must start with a change of the heart. This is probably the core of this message, and it is the core of the speech on the Sermon on the Mountain, which is considered, it is the Magna Carta of Christianity in chapter 5 to 7 of Matthew's Gospel. That is accomplished by the infusion in the human spirit with the good news of God's radical grace. Jesus knew that anyone who really gets that message of universal and unconditional forgiveness by God will turn to God in abject gratitude and devotion, desiring to be God's kind of person. From that conversion, a radical shift in behavior is inevitable. Real change comes from the inside out. Okay, for this message. So her conclusion is that in the Gospels, Jesus is not gentle, meek, or mild. He is robust, aggressive, uncompromising, incapable of negotiating. His perspective on God's ways with humans, argumentative in the uttermost, abusive with people he did not like, and with ideas he thought were erroneous, simple forwards. He was immensely tough minded and uncompromisingly courageous in what he stood for, without the slightest willingness to back down, compromise. She carries on. Jesus's character displays a number of distinctly identifiable qualities. So this is, the quintessence of the psychological portrayal of Jesus she thinks can be found in the Gospels. He operates from a conflicted emotional and social life. He was illegitimate son of a mother. His father, in some of his versions, didn't recognize him. So if you didn't believe he was the son of God, he was the son of an unmarried woman with, basically fallen pregnant without being married, which, as you know, even in our society, up to probably 50 or 60 years ago, was usually led to social ostracism. He finds his consolation in a unique and intense perception of his relation with God. He has an ambivalent sense of himself. He is persistently anti-establishment and critical of the father figures of the authorities. He stands for those who are marginalized in society, but is not preoccupied with them, so he instrumentalizes them for his political project. He keeps company with 12 close male followers. He seems to be sought out by women for his general intimate sensitivity toward them. He has an idealized image of God's intended destiny for the world and for his own vocation and destiny in that model. He is capable of surprising expressions of humor, antipathy, and rage, and is stubbornly committed to the path on which he has set his course. He never backs down, even in the face of his own pitiful demands. Okay, so this is quite a robust portrait of Jesus, and I wanted you to be exposed to this because there is a huge amount of literature. There is a huge amount of, especially in recent years, attempts to reconstruct how Jesus must have looked like as a human being, done just on the basis of the texts, without presupposing that he was God, which on one hand might strike us as slightly irreverent, and yet on the other hand are quite interesting because they force us, and this is something that personally I find refreshing, to look twice, to look again at the text, to look again at the ways in which we represent Jesus, because the classical ways in which we represent him to ourselves are just as well the product of models we have inherited. Just to finish, I'd be able to say only a few words about this, but if you have some time, on the New Yorker in 2010, there's been an article which I find really, it's one of the most interesting I've read to prepare this lecture, by this art critic called Adam Gottlieb. What did Jesus do? Reading and unreading the Gospels. So he reads the Gospels from the viewpoint of an art critic, and I think it comes out with something so compelling that there's been a lot of reactions to it by biblical scholars and theologians. So if you Google this article and the reactions on the internet, you will see that a lot of people have taken the trouble to reply to him because I think he really kind of puts his finger on paradoxes, on points of tension in the texts of the Gospels and the history of the perception of Jesus, which I think are really, really interesting. But let's see. So I'm going to talk about this article also next time, because next time we're going to see whether Jesus was a historical figure or a myth. So he was an historical figure, but certainly the way it has been handed over to tradition has some mythical features. Okay, so it is, and there's a huge kind of conversation about how do we come closer to the historical figure of Jesus. But today, I just want to quote you another aspect of this article by Gottlieb, but by all means, if you have some time, go and read it. It's really worth it, which are the ways in which he tries to reconstruct the human traits of Jesus. He says in number 41, the human traits of Jesus are evident: intelligent, short temper, and an ironic dueling wit. What seems new about Jesus is not his piety or divine detachment, but the humanity of his irritability and impatience. Again, you know, people observe this about him. He's no Buddha. I told you that this is one of the stereotypes. He gets annoyed at the stupidity of his followers, again, the inability to grasp an obvious point. He is verbally spry and even a little shifty. He likes defiant, enigmatic paradoxes and pregnant parables that never try to close, perhaps by design. Jesus' morality has a brush, sidewise indifference to conventional ideas of goodness. That's certainly true. His pet style blends the epigrammatic with the enigmatic. When he makes that complaint about the prophet having no honor in his own hometown, or says exasperatedly that there is no point in lighting a candle unless you intend to put it on a candlestick, his voice carries a disdain for the props of piety that still feels startling. And so with the tale of the boy who wastes his inheritance but gets a feast from his father while his dutiful brother doesn't, or the one about the weeping poor who is worthier than her good prim onlookers, or about the passion of Mary who is better than her hardworking sister Martha. There is a wild gaiety about Jesus' moral teachings, which still leaps off the page. And if we don't perceive it, it's because we have been a bit too desensitized by the constant exposure to the clean version of Jesus, or the received version of Jesus and the Gospels we have often through devotional representation of him that are dominant in the Christian discourse of our denominations. He is informal in a new way, too, that remains unusual among prophets. McCulloch is the history professor at Oxford, a brilliant guy. He's retired, someone I know very well, points out that he continually addresses God as Abba, Father, or even Dad, and that the expression translated in the King James Version as a solemn, verily I say unto you, is actually a quirky Aramaic throat clearer, like Dr. Johnson's depend upon it. This social radicalism still shines through, not a programmatic radicalism of national revolution, but one of the Kerouac-like Satori seeking, or in Latin, and seeking on the road. And the social radicalism is highly social. It was a highly social being, Jesus. The sharpest opposition in the Gospels, he thinks, is between John the Pastor and Jesus the Feaster. Jesus eats and drinks with oars and highwaymen, turns water into wine, and finally, in one way or another, establishes a mystical union at a feast through his humble instruments of bread and wine. The table is the altar in every sense. Jesus lived within a Mediterranean Jewish peasant culture, a culture of clan and cohort, in which who eats with whom defines who stands where and why. So the way Jesus repeatedly violates the rules on eating, on commensality, would have shocked his contemporaries. He dines with people of a different social rank, which would have shocked most Roman, and with people of different tribal allegiance, which would have shocked most Jews. Jesus isn't a hedonist or an Epicurean, of course, but he clearly isn't an ascetic either. He feeds the multitudes rather than instructing them how to go without. He's interested in saving people living normal lives, buying and selling what they can, rather than in retreating into the company of those who have already arrived at a moral conclusion about themselves. I hope this is not too scattered, but I really thought that it is important to be exposed to different perceptions, how widely different the perceptions of Jesus can be by people who have dedicated a huge amount of energy and time and talent to try to reconstruct the psychology and the humanity of Jesus from the Gospels. Now, who is right and who is wrong? Well, I think it's up to every one of us to decide. I don't think there is a canonical, or there can be a canonical representation of the psychology of the personality of the humanity of Jesus. And I think that the fact that from the Gospels we can draw such contrasting reconstructions of his character is not a sign of deficiency in the Gospels. But on the contrary, is a sign that they succeeded in what they wanted to be, wanted to do, which is inspire enough curiosity about this character. And every great character in history gives rise, even the most recent ones. I mean, when you read biographies of Churchill, as I've done more than one, it can be even someone who's just as recent as him. When they write a biography of him, they can represent him in contrasting ways, which are quite subtly different from each other. So no surprise that this should happen to Jesus as well. But it's quite interesting to see that, and I think this is the greatest testament to the real humanity of Jesus, the extent to which so many are fascinated by, even despite the scant availability of data about him, so many are so fascinated by his character and keep wanting to go back and wanting to try to have an understanding of his psychology, of his personality. And there are definitely traits that emerge about him, and you hope you saw them through the different testimonies. So I hope that you will be that your curiosity has been enticed. And please do another look at the articles I quoted if you have some time. And there is some bibliography that goes with them. So if you want to embark on reading one of these biographies or attempts of reconstructing the psychology of Jesus and his identity, I promise you won't be disappointed.